When I first read Northern Lights, there was a particular moment somewhere around the midpoint, a particular reveal, that had me properly shocked. Granted, I was pretty young, but I hadn't seen it coming, and it was terrific. Episode 2 of the BBC's His Dark Materials, I reckon, spoils that moment in the truest sense of the word. Just totally ruins it. Fumbles it completely. Makes a right bloody mess of it. Really botches it. Screws it up entirely. It's a real shame. So if you are reading the book for the first time, I'd recommend watching no further. Because it really When we left off, the audience, but not Lyra, had just learnt that Mrs. Coulter has some kind of dealings with the magisterium when Father MacPhail arrived at Coulter's flat. Our imaginary animated adaptation has reached the start of episode 4, while the BBC show is about halfway through episode 2. In the show, this scene with MacPhail leads directly into a scene in which Lyra and Coulter argue and the Golden Monkey wrestles Pan to the floor. There are several things I don't like about how this is handled. The first is Lyra's choice to start carrying the alethiometer in a shoulder bag. This does feature in the book, but the context in the show makes it an obviously poor decision. She's just landed herself in trouble by listening in on Coulter's meeting, and she should be smart enough to realise that suddenly carrying a bag around is only going to draw attention to it, especially when she knows the monkey has been spying on her. We should have introduced the bag earlier, after the monkey revelation. Keeping the alethiometer close is wise after all, but it should be a more carefully considered choice. I also think that Coulter's anger in this scene does a disservice to her character. Simmering anger is all well and good when Coulter's alone, and Ruth Wilson plays the hell out of it, but I feel like she ought to have more self-control than she displays in this scene. It seems unlikely to me that she would have been able to climb the ranks of the magisterium, especially while her gender's working against her, without a near-perfect mastery over her demeanour. She should be tightly wound, bottled up rather than explosive. During this scene in the book, which stands alone rather than following on directly from something else, Coulter is very calm, almost detached, which makes a much more powerful statement than having her lose control. Not the shoulder bag, dear, said Mrs. Coulter as Lyra came out of her bedroom. She was loosening the cramped way some roses had been bunched into a vase. Oh, please, Mrs. Coulter, I think it really suits. She didn't finish the sentence, because Mrs. Coulter's demon sprang off the sofa and pinned Pantalaimon to the carpet before he could move. He took one of Pantalaimon's ears and pulled as if he intended to tear it off. Not angrily either, but with a cold, curious force that was horrifying to see. Lyra sobbed in terror. Don't, please. Mrs. Coulter looked up from her flowers. Do as I tell you then, she said. Now that, I think, is much more effective than Coulter blowing her top, if you can overlook my terrible delivery at least. So for this reason, I think we should lose the reveal that Lord Asriel is Lyra's father in this scene. Not necessarily because it comes too early in the story, I don't actually have a problem with that, but in order to maintain Coulter's measured, calculated behaviour. This scene also reveals another limitation of trying to do demons in live action. The relationship between people and their demons is usually very tactile. They both draw great comfort from physical contact. In fact, a lack of physical closeness between a person and their demon is likely to signify that something is not quite right. In this scene, when the monkey releases Pan, he and Lyra's first instinctive priority should be to get close to each other. Pantalaimon fled to Lyra at once, and she scooped him up to her face to kiss and gentle. I know creating photoreal animal characters is never easy, but I'm sure it's that much more difficult having them interact physically with actors. Again, not a problem in straight-up animation. And yeah, as you've probably already worked out, I don't think this scene should follow directly on from the scene with MacPhail, which means I've already rabbited on for ages without actually getting to the start of the episode. I think we should start with the breakfast scene on the terrace, where Lyra presses Coulter for updates in the search for Roger and... Oh man, I totally forgot to say anything about this last episode. Good lord, this is a long way off the rails already. Never mind, maybe it'll all come together in the recap. So in the book, the carrot that Coulter uses to keep Lyra on the line is the promise of going on an expedition to the north. She even goes so far as to buy Lyra furs and boots and the like. Meanwhile, Lyra all but forgets about Roger. Every so often she thought of Roger, and felt uneasy, but there was an opera to go to, or the Royal Arctic Institute to visit, and then she forgot him again. That seems pretty weird, especially considering the emphasis the book later puts on their friendship. So I think the show's made the right call here, by changing Lyra's focus from the Northern Expedition to the search for Roger. It gives Lyra a much clearer, more immediate objective and motivation. So let's have the argument that escalates into this be about Roger rather than the shoulder bag, and not have Coulter flying off the handle. Moving on, at long last, let's catch up with the Gyptians. In the show, the fallout from the raid on the Goblet Den is explored in this scene on the Costa's boat. We've already moved a few bits from this scene to earlier in the story, but I think we should come back to this moment between John Farr and Mark Costa. This, along with a few beats in later episodes, strongly implies to me that Farr might be Billy's father, something that's never suggested in the books. You know what? I like it, so let's go with it. It's handled subtly and adds depth to the characters without spoon-feeding. It could even be considered fairly progressive, as it's not treated like some dirty secret, and it casts no judgment on Mark Costa for having 2 children, likely with different fathers, and being a single mum. In fact, her closeness with Farr in this scene could imply that she's a single mum through choice rather than circumstance. I really like finding progressive elements in media that don't have lanterns hanging off them. That's definitely not to say that I'm against things which are progressive and proud, but I think we need more of these quietly confident kinds of thing as well, because they work to normalise their subjects, which is, I think, very valuable. However, I've talked before about how Ma Costa ought to have a more active role in the story, and that she should retain her queen among the Gyptians status from the book. So if we're keeping in this implied past relationship with Far, we'll have to be careful not to let it undermine her authority, which should be entirely her own rather than based on her proximity to the throne. The reason I keep banging on about Ma Costa's status is that she should function in various ways as an antithesis to Mrs. Coulter. Although the two characters never meet, the differences and similarities between them can tell us a lot about the world. I won't get too deep into this just yet, for spoiler reasons, but for now I think it's worth pointing out that Ma Costa's authority is readily accepted by her community, and presumably earned gradually and naturally over time, while Mrs. Coulter's position has been fought for tooth and nail, and still raises the eyebrows of people who will never accept her as a peer. This contrast bleeds out into our wider impressions of both Gyptian culture and the magisteriums. Because the Gyptians are able to exist outside of the jurisdiction of the magisterium, they're allowed to have a much more liberal, equal society. Next comes a sequence with two scenes intercut. Mrs. Coulter visits the Goblet Den, while Lyra takes the opportunity to sneak into Coulter's office. The scenes are intercut to create a sense of false tension. If you stop and think about it for a moment, Coulter apparently gets to the Gobbler hideout, helps the kids write a bunch of letters, then gets back to her flat in the same amount of time as it takes Lyra to get through the vents and rifle through the desk. It's a bit naff. I don't think the story needs spicing up in this way. It stands up well enough on its own. So let's do the two scenes separately. First off, Lyra in the study. This is fine, narratively, but this shot right here is completely ridiculous. I'm sure that anyone with even a vague understanding of the concept of demons will be able to interpret this immediately, and it seems ludicrous that Lyra can't. This is the spoiler I was ranting about at the top of the episode. It gives away far too much, and it's a massive shame, because the reveal of what the Gobblers are actually up to should be a properly shocking moment for both the characters and the audience. The show squanders all that potential by showing us this. It sucks. This shot even features in the trailers. They weren't even trying to make it a mystery. So yeah, let's get rid of that bloody thing. But have Lyra find letters headed General Oblation Board, and some papers referencing the station, and maybe the chartering of a ship, or the rental of various warehouses in London, or the hiring of Tartar soldiers. You know, stuff that could be considered little clues in the mystery, rather than a literal picture of the answer, which the lead character somehow doesn't understand. On then, to the scene with Coulter in the Gobbler Den. I've got to say, this scene just doesn't work for me, despite the fact that Roger taunting Coulter is a really good little moment. It took me a while to figure out what was wrong with the scene, so I started by picking apart its function in the show. Well, it shows Coulter in her Leader of the Gobbler context, but we already know she's one of them, so it's not a reveal. It does give us an info dump in the form of Roger's voiceover.
Dear Lyra, we're about to go on a trip. All the way to the north.
But this is a bit off too. What he's saying is true, but what possible reason would the Gobblers have for actually telling him the truth? What's Coulter's motivation in the scene then? Is it to find out who Roger is? But surely she already knows who Roger is, since the implication in the first episode is that he got kidnapped because Lyra wanted him to live with Coulter too. I mean, I suppose you could argue that she doesn't know what he looks like, but then she doesn't do anything with the information anyway. Possibly she's there for a more practical reason, like to subdue and calm the children by trying to convince them they're safe, so as to make them easier to transport. In the corresponding scene in the book, which comes before Coulter even meets Lyra, this actually does seem to be her aim. But in the show it just doesn't feel right. That's the thought that made it click. The problem isn't so much the scene, as the lead up to it. In the book, most of the children are persuaded to go along with the Gobblers. We see during Tony Macarius' abduction how Coulter charms him with a kindness he's not used to, and tempts him with chocolatl? With hot chocolate. In the letter writing scene, the kids are totally enamoured with Mrs. Coulter. They had never seen a lady like this. She was so gracious and sweet and kind that they felt they hardly deserved their good luck, and whatever she asked, they'd give it gladly so as to stay in her presence a little longer. Meanwhile, in the show, the only way we see the Gobblers operating is like this. Not quite so gentle. So the audience is likely to assume that all of these kids have been picked up in a similar way, which means there's going to be no ambiguity in their situation. They know full well they've been kidnapped and that the people around them are not their friends. So Coulter's trick of helping them write letters to their parents seems very unlikely to work on anyone but the youngest children. This is undermined further by the fact that Roger knows who she is and obviously doesn't trust her at all. So how do we fix this? I suppose we could change Billy's kidnapping. We could have him arguing with his mum and Tony in the lead up to Tony's ceremony, and then get lured away while he's out sulking. Maybe that would help? But there's another element in play, another departure by the show from the book, and it's a bit of a weird one. Stay with me, we're going on a tangent from this tangent. In the book, it's occasionally implied that Coulter has some kind of power that can only be described as supernatural. Her ability to charm and mesmerise the children, for instance, or when she confronts Adele, the journalist, at her party. Mrs. Coulter seemed to be charged with some kind of ambaric force. She even smelled different. A hot smell of heated metal. Poor Adele Starminster had no force to resist. Her demon fell limp on her shoulder, and the woman herself seemed to be unable to stand upright. Now, the show doesn't make any reference to this power. I can definitely see the logic for this, especially since they're emphasising Coulter's battle against sexism. It makes her a stronger, more interesting character if her ascent through the ranks of the Magisterium is driven by her own skills and ingenuity, rather than due to this pseudo-magical ability. She's powerful and dangerous enough entirely on her own terms. Also, the power's pretty vague, and it doesn't have that much of a bearing on the story. Right up until it does. I'll avoid spoilers, but there comes a point way down the line where Coulter's power does become a quite important plot point. In the show, it comes out of nowhere and feels like something she can just suddenly do, which is weird and clumsy. We should establish it earlier, and this letter writing scene is the perfect place. Although it might be nice to put some little suggestions of it in earlier episodes too. So we can see how Coulter is able to charm the children, sort of mesmerise them, and when she comes to speak to Roger, it can even work on him too, confirming beyond doubt that she's wielding some kind of power. But wait, our audience doesn't know that Coulter's a gobbler yet, and I think we can do a better reveal than this scene. So let's stick a pin in it and save it for a later episode. It would be a shame not to include at least one scene with Billy and Roger though. So let's have a version of this one, where the kids are being taken away and Roger is giving Sister Clara a grilling. Come to think of it, everything Roger asks about in this scene is stuff he's already said in his letter.
We're going on a trip. To the north.
Which makes me think that that was a bit of an afterthought. We can't have the kids actually leaving though, because we still have to come back to the letter writing scene. So let's have Roger doing some investigating. He can try and get some information out of Sister Clara, who can mention that the kids have a special visitor to look forward to. The kids can react with genuine excitement. Even Billy Costa, giving Roger a little mystery of his own to puzzle over. I suppose, if we lose the letter writing scene, then we need to find another reason for Coulter to leave the flat long enough for Lyra to raid her study, but I guess we don't necessarily need to see where she's gone. In fact, if we don't know where she's gone, then we can include Lyra racing back to her desk when Coulter comes back after all. Next comes another nighttime scene in which Lyra is studying the alethiometer, now hidden in a makeshift den and... Wait, what was that? What's that red light? Oh well, mistakes happen I suppose, and I bet someone's kicking themselves for it, so it would just be mean to point it out, wouldn't it? Wouldn't have this problem in animation though. Anyway, this scene includes a lot of Pan and Lyra recapping the story to each other, which we can lose because it's tedious and handholdy. I do think it's worth having a scene with the alethiometer though, just to keep it present in the story, and to establish that Lyra's enchanted with it, despite not knowing how to work it. It really is a shame that the needle doesn't move as it should though, especially while she's asking questions. It'd be fun to have it making little references all the time, which viewers familiar with the books might pick up on. Let's return to the Gyptians for a bit, and have the moment in which Benjamin is recruiting Tony for a mission, without the say-so of either the Gyptian leaders or Tony's ma. We can give a bit more detail than the show offers, probably including Benjamin copping to the fact that he's acting alone, and that Tony needs to keep it a secret. And so we come, finally, to the titular cocktail party. During the previous episode of our version, and throughout this one, we've put the audience just a step or two ahead of Lyra in terms of what they know. Lyra will have realised that MacPhail works for the Magisterium, but the audience will recognise him as someone concerned with the Gobbler's activity. The papers in Coulter's desk will be all but meaningless to Lyra, but canny viewers might have been able to make a connection. This is the point where everything comes together, and both Lyra and the audience learn that Coulter's actually running the Gobblers. In the show, this information all comes in one go from Adele Starminster, a character we've never met, who just sits Lyra down and tells her everything. It's pretty lame. In the book, however, Lyra goes around the party overhearing little pieces of information until everything finally clicks. Here are a few choice pieces I think we should include. The last experiments have confirmed what I've always believed, that dust is an emanation from the Dark Principle itself. And if we could isolate the Dark Principle, I don't think Lord Asriel will be troubling us for quite some time. In the fortress of Svalbard, I'm told, guarded by the Panzerbjorn, you know, armoured bears. In the Middle Ages, parents would give their children to the church to be monks or nuns. The unfortunate brats were known as oblates, means a sacrifice, an offering, something of that sort. Since we haven't had Coulter tell Lyra who her father is yet, we could also include a moment where one of the guests asks Lyra about her parents, and seems to be confused by the answer. Eventually, Lyra will come within earshot of Adele's conversation. That's the very reason the oblation board was set up, a middle-aged man was saying to a young woman, who gazed at him in admiration. As our good hostess here could tell you. Really? Said the young woman, wide-eyed. Is she involved with the oblation board? My dear, she is the oblation board. In the book, Lyra actually hangs around the party for a little longer after learning the truth, even having a chat with Lord Boreal. I think it's better if she just leaves as soon as she can, though, as she does in the show. So let's have Adele take Lyra aside and give her the last piece of the puzzle.
The initials you see, General Oblation Board.
Gobbler.
whereupon Coulter notices what's going on, and we can have her get rid of Adele by using her weird powers overtly for the first time, if we refer to the quote from the book I was banging on about earlier. I quite like this, structurally, because it means we've got a revelation about Coulter being followed up immediately with another mystery. Boreal will, of course, follow Adele out. Meanwhile, Lyra makes a break for it, in a manner nicely in line with her roof clambering days at Jordan. The end of the episode comes pretty soon after, but I think we should expand on Lyra's escape a bit. But first, we'll follow Boreal and see him do away with Adele. This isn't something that happens in the book, but I think it's a good addition because it demonstrates Boreal's power, in that he can kill someone more or less in broad daylight and be confident about getting away with it. However, the manner in which he kills Adele is another example of the show failing to get demons right. This butterfly is not a butterfly. It's a sentient adult who shares the feelings of their person. Adele is scared, so the butterfly should be scared, not hovering calmly in front of Boreal's face. Also, there's a huge social taboo around touching another person's demon. It would be considered assault. So why does the butterfly just sit on Boreal's hand and wait to be crushed? I suppose, though, the manner of death does at least establish that if a demon dies, their person does too. So let's have Boreal lull Adele into a sense of security first. Rather than bundling Adele into a car, he can be friendly and tell her not to worry about Mrs. Coulter. Then, once Adele's let her guard down, Boreal can snatch the butterfly out of the air. He could be smiling at her when he suddenly claps his hands together and kills them both. Boreal can return to the party to find Coulter looking for him. She needs to coordinate a search for Lyra without giving anything away to her other guests. So we can have her whispering instructions to Boreal while smiling politely and appearing calm. Perhaps we can even have her interrupted by another guest and having to make small talk, giving Lyra that much more of a head start, which Lyra can use to take a moment to sit and talk with Pan, unpacking the huge amount of information she's just picked up at the party, trying to get her thoughts in order and decide what to do. She does eventually get caught though. But let's make more of this too. In the show, Pan gets drawn away by the weird whistling fox, who helped catch both Billy and Roger. Come to think of it, this fox is an odd inclusion. They seem to have mesmeric abilities, but it never actually comes to anything. The book treats this moment much more like an action sequence, and I think we should too. She looked around and saw two men running at her, one from each side. Pantalaimon launched himself as a leopard at the closer man's demon, bowling her backwards so that she tangled with the man's legs. Lyra darted past him. Pantalaimon, an eagle now, swooped at her and cried left, left. She swerved that way and saw a gap between the cold spirit barrels. But those throwing nets. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but it's a decent sequence. And to use it to cap off a couple of episodes which have been pretty light on action makes sense to me. It proves that Lyra and Pan are fairly capable in a pinch, and it's also a good example of demons in an action sequence, especially those who can still change form. And so, like the show, we'll end the episode with Lyra caught in a net. Time for the recap. We open with Lyra and Coulter having a tense breakfast on the terrace. Lyra presses Coulter for progress in the search for Roger, but Coulter tells her it's time to give up on him. This leads to an argument in which Coulter shows her true colours. The monkey grabs Pan, but Coulter stays alarmingly cool and calm. We then see Mark Costa and John Farr processing the fact that the raid on the Goblet Den was unsuccessful, and there's the suggestion that Billy might be Farr's son. Back to Lyra, who's now on Pan's level in terms of her distrust for Coulter. While Coulter's out, Lyra takes the opportunity to rifle through her study and finds references to the General Oblation Board and the station at Bolvanga. She needs to rush back to her desk when she hears Coulter returning. That night, we see Roger questioning Sister Clara and being told that someone's coming to visit soon, and the kids get all excited about it. Meanwhile, Lyra continues her secret study of the alethiometer, which seems like it might be trying to tell her something, and Benjamin recruits Tony Costa for some off-the-books work. Then we get to the cocktail party, during which Lyra hears an almost overwhelming amount of information, including the fact that Asriel is captive of the armoured bears, and finally learns that Coulter is head gobbler. Lyra runs off while Boreal is busy dispatching Adele Starminster. Mrs. Coulter tries to coordinate the search for Lyra while still navigating her party. Finally, Lyra, after putting up a decent fight, is captured by some of Coulter's men. So I'm going to try and go off script for this and see how it works out. I just want to say thank you to everybody who's subscribed so far. I've got 25 subscribers, which, yeah, in the scheme of things is not a huge amount, but it really means a lot, and I'm really chuffed with it. And it's been hugely motivating. Turns out I don't need that much of a nudge to feel motivated, so that's good. Yeah, and thank you very much for watching and persevering. Do hit subscribe if you fancy keeping up to date, and I'd be really grateful if you would share the video around and give it a like. You can find various links to social media stuff in the description if you want to follow me on there. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you next time.